I'm Graham Dawson. I'm the director of the Centre for Research in Memory, Narrative and Histories, which is hosting today's symposium. And on behalf of the Centre and the University of Brighton, I'd like to offer a very warm welcome to everybody here today. We've got members of this university, we've got members of our neighbouring university at Sussex, we've got people coming in from the town and city, we've got people travelling from further afield. You're all very welcome. I'm going to spend just a minute doing a little bit of housekeeping. Just a few quick things, which is to say we're not expecting a fire drill, so if there is a fire alarm, we need to evacuate the building, which is pretty straightforward. We can go out of the two doors down there, down a flight of stairs. We shouldn't use the lift, so we'll find ways of managing those who can't use the lifts in an orderly and calm fashion, and we're gathering outside in the quadrant there. Hopefully that isn't going to be necessary. Toilets, you'll find, if you haven't discovered already, just through the back door on the right, there are some immediately available toilets. And there are more toilets available down on the ground floor in the vicinity of the cafe, where I think some of you found your way there, in that lobby area. You'll find other toilets down there. I've been asked, currently one of our speakers is reformatting a PowerPoint presentation at the back, but I've been asked other than that if we can keep the back table clear of equipment and clothing, because that's where they'll bring coffee, which is due up here, tea and coffee break at 4, and that's going to be in this room. And then we're having a break for refreshments again of a more substantial kind and a more substantial break at 6 o'clock, and that's going to be downstairs in the cafe area, which you can see looking down out of the window there. It's down the flight of stairs, and you can't miss it on the right. So that is the housekeeping. I wanted just to say a few words of welcome in relation to the centre of the event. The Centre for Research in Memory, Narrative and Histories exists to develop research at the University of Brighton that's concerned with the significance of the past for our lived experience, our politics, our social identities, our social relationships in the present. We emphasise the plural word histories in our title because we recognise history as a contested terrain, apart from anything else, multiple histories. We're particularly interested in exploring the relations between powerful or official narratives of the past and those which give expression to marginalised and neglected histories and historical experience. And we're also concerned with the complex interconnections between the present and the past, which are captured in concepts of memory, understood as a political and a cultural, as well as a psychological and a personal phenomenon and process. The Centre is committed to facilitating engagement between academic scholars and the work of creative practitioners, community activists, political activists, others that are involved in the making of histories, in representing the past, in organising forms of commemoration. And we also are committed to engaging with those who have lived those histories as their own experience and live with those memories. We're committed to a participatory and egalitarian ethos in education and in the production of knowledge. And we're committed to developing historical research that challenges social inequalities, oppressions and injustices, interrogates received meanings of the past, and produces alternative accounts that help to generate fresh thinking about possible futures. Further information about the Centre, I think, is available lurking around in some forms of handouts that we may have, but it's also available on our website for you to explore. And I'd like to encourage anyone who's interested in keeping in touch with us, you can join our mailing list, and we can keep in touch with you about future events. Now, my colleagues and I are honoured then that Edward Timms and Semi Grixu Timms decided that our centre would be a suitable host for this important and necessary commemorative symposium, which I think sits very centrally with all the kinds of concerns that I've been explaining to you that we are here to further. A commemorative symposium to mark, to remember, to try to understand the Armenian genocide in this its centenary year. And this symposium that they've conceived and have been planning for many months now, together with Jackie Stimson and my colleague Sam Carroll, who's been involved in some of the practical organising, a lot of the practical organising at the university end, brings together this large and diverse gathering. We're very pleased to see so many people here today. There are students, scholars, writers, artists, teachers, members of the Armenian diaspora, linked to the genocide by personal and family experience and history. There are also people of Turkish origin here to bear witness and to bring solidarity. Some of us here are deeply informed by experience and knowledge of these events, and will be sharing that. Others are here to become better informed, to learn the lessons of the Armenian genocide for other conflicts. So I'd like to offer a warm round of applause to thank the organisers for putting on the symposium, and then we can get started.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Welcome everybody. I hope that at the back of the room people can hear, and I hope particularly that people can see, because the visual quality of some of the presentations, particularly the second one, I think it's going to be very important. So please do move your chairs slightly, or insofar as it's possible, to get a good view of the screen. So I've lost my label already, but I am Edward Timms, one of the coordinators, and we are extremely grateful to Graham Dawson and Sam Carroll and the University of Brighton for hosting something, since I have absolutely no credentials at all at the University of Brighton, having taught at Sussex University and Cambridge University and at Ankara Middle East Technical University, but never spoken before at the University of Brighton. So it's a great honour to be here. We'll try to keep the introductions short, because you have in your conference pack information, I think, about all of the speakers and their backgrounds and their approaches to the subject. And so I don't think that we need to spend a lot of time telling you who is who. But towards the end of the conference pack, there is an interesting phrase about thanking the supporters and sponsors who have made this event possible, clearly inviting distinguished speakers covering travel and accommodation expenses, and indeed something for us to eat and drink during the symposium. All of these things add up. And I think very unusually, we have members of the Brighton and Hove Turkish community who are providing the necessary funding for this event. So they didn't particularly want to have their names listed, but it must be quite unusual perhaps to have an Armenian-focused symposium supported in this way, and may I say on behalf of all of us how grateful we are that this has been made possible. A brief word about my own sense of why we have met and what we hope to achieve here. Very brief. I'd like to start by mentioning a book called Passage to Ararat. Many of you will know that this is the symbolic Armenian mountain, which unfortunately is on the wrong side of the frontier, and it's on the Turkish side. The book, published 40 years ago, Passage to Ararat, by Michael J. Arlen, a writer, an American writer of Armenian descent, who is discovering or rediscovering his Armenian heritage. And as he worked his way through some of the literature on the subject, he made the remark that the Armenians, the fate of the Armenians, always seemed to be a footnote in somebody else's story. It didn't seem to have its own independent narrative. Narrative, our key word. And surprisingly, we often find this is the case even now in the voluminous literature about the First World War. There have been literally dozens and scores, maybe hundreds of books published in the last couple of years about the First World War, and I would be most interested to identify those which really give full weight to what happened in the Ottoman Empire, the fate of the Armenians. I was looking, for example, by a book by the eminent historian John Keegan, a 500-page history of the First World War, and I found in those 500 pages, you won't guess, 12 lines, just 12 lines about the Ottomans' campaign of genocide against their Armenian subjects, which Keegan, the historian, mentions as this is a quote, a lamentable local outcome. So, okay, it's sad, it's unfortunate, lamentable, but it is local. It has no significance beyond its own parameters, that's implied. So for him, for Keegan, the Ottoman government's treatment of the Armenians doesn't belong to what he calls the history of the war itself. It sort of happened during the war, but it's not part of the war. I found that absolutely extraordinary. It's like saying that the Jewish Holocaust, for which of course the Armenian genocide set such a precedent, the Jewish Holocaust does not belong to the history of the Second World War. Well, obviously, many of you will know that in the teaching of the Second World War, the Nazi period and the Holocaust is standard fare. But what's happened to Armenian history? Why has it been, as Graham was saying at the beginning, become marginalized? So I think one of the aims of this commemorative symposium is to restore the ordeals of the Armenians to the mainstream narrative of modernity. After all, the Armenian tragedy encapsulates many of the dilemmas of our own age, the tensions between religious and national identity, the tensions between homeland and diaspora, and of course between multiculturalism on the one hand and ethnic cleansing on the other. So you'll see from the sequence of speakers that we have 5 speakers who will present segments of a specifically Armenian narrative, from the cultural achievements of the early 20th century through the deportations and massacres of the First World War to the post-war struggles and traumas of survivors and exiles. But we begin with something slightly different, which is a framework presentation by Professor Bob Brecher of the University of Brighton, who will be the first of our 2 speakers in this first session. Bob contributes, as many other people in this room do, to the internationalism of the occasion. When I was talking with him earlier this afternoon, he mentioned that he was brought up speaking Czech and German and comes from a Jewish background and learned English as a student, his parents having been refugees arriving in the UK. And it's that kind of context and that kind of sensitivity to the fate of marginal social groups that I think we will be focusing on. So for that reason, as well as because of his topic, I think that we are very fortunate to have him framing the events with his topic. I will just say that we'll take although the first 2 papers are obviously very different in character, but we will take them without an interruption. So if you have questions about the first paper, please save them up until the end of the second paper, and then our 2 speakers will come to the front and there will be a question and answer session. And may I please invite you, when you're formulating your questions, to make sure they really are questions. We don't want, please, in this academic environment, people to stand up and start making political speeches. Try to keep the questions fairly concise and try to focus them on the subject matter that has been presented by the speakers. So may I then invite Bob Brecher to come to the front and speak on the subject of what is it that matters so much about genocide. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, why does genocide matter so much? That sounds like a really stupid question. After all, if it's a question that anybody needs to ask, they're not going to understand the answer. Compare, for instance, why does rape matter so much? Why does slavery matter so much? Questions like these are not intended to raise any doubts at all. There's no doubt that these things actually do matter. But nonetheless, I think the questions need to be asked. And they need to be asked because reasons for conclusions matter, even if those conclusions are obvious. That's to say, it's just obvious that genocide matters. It might not be quite so obvious what the reasons are for that. And I think that's what we need to try and understand. In fact, I think especially if conclusions are obvious, we need to understand the reasons why they're obvious. So in this case, I think those reasons have to do with what is very specific about genocide, what differentiates it from other acts of violence. Note that my suggestion is that there's something that differentiates genocide from other forms of violence. I'm not claiming at this point that there's something that makes it worse or indeed less awful than other crimes against humanity. And I'm issuing a plea that we retain that phrase, crimes against humanity, because for all its liberal baggage and history, I think it's one that can still do a lot of work, especially in the world that we actually inhabit today. So what is it that's specific about genocide? Well, the term describes the killing of a genus, or sort, of people. That immediately tells us that it's a historically fairly recent term, capable of having been developed only as, in scare quotes, we, by which of course we always mean we in the West, started to think in terms of sorts of people at all. And particularly of sorts of people in racialized terms. So I think there are three basic characteristics of genocide. Mass killing, certainly. Mass killing on the basis of ascribed identity, and on the basis of an ascribed identity that is in some sense unavoidable or unalterable. And I'll be saying a little bit more about that. So, mass killing. Genocide, inasmuch as it's constituted by the killing of a sort of people, is obviously a form of mass killing. Now, how many makes a mass is a question I'm going to leave aside quite deliberately. It's enough for now, I think, that genocide is not like, for instance, serial murder. Second, identity. For a group to self-identify as a sort, or to be identified as such by others, some criteria of identity need to be in place. These might be race, creed, ethnicity. But of course, what it is for these terms to be in place might be understood very differently. You might suppose, for instance, that there really are races or ethnicities. You might not think that such criteria are biologically, logically, or both illiterate. But that's not really the point. Either way, so long as some people believe that these identities are real, for instance, biologically real, then even if they're mistaken, and I think they are, there can be and there is racism, and there can be and there is, in scare quotes, ethnic cleansing. The fact that there are no biological races, the fact that ethnicity is an empty term, makes no difference to that. Let me put it another way. Genocide targets naturalized groups of people. It's the destruction of a naturalized group of people, however such a group may be identified, or by whom. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But the point about naturalization, I think, matters, because genocide concerns the slaughter of people on account of who they are, not on account of what they believe, what they think, or what they do. It's a matter of who they are. And this, of course, brings me to what I think is the central point, that this sort of identity is, in some sense, inevitable. It can't be changed. And I think this is fundamental. People are subjected to genocide, as I say, on account of the people that they are, on account of who they are. Tutsi, Roma, Jew, Armenian. And not just who they are, but also who they cannot but be. This sort of identity, whether self-ascribed or imputed by other groups, cannot be undone. And I think it may be on that account that comparison, no more than that, but still some comparison with both rape and with torture, those comparisons are apt, despite the differences. Think of the overwhelming instances of rape. You cannot unbecome a woman, and are therefore a target, whether of misogyny or military tactics against the civilian population. You cannot unbecome an Iraqi and are therefore a target for the American torturers. Of course, this can pose a problem in respect of particular instances of mass slaughter, because it's not always clear whether or not members of the group in question identify themselves or are identified in this sort of way. Namely, in terms of being somebody they cannot but be. So, for instance, to take one example, was the extermination of the Cambodian intelligentsia by the Khmer Rouge an act of genocide or not? I think that depends on the extent to which, in this case, being an intellectual, whatever that might mean, is at once a matter of who you are and who you cannot but be. Unlike, for instance, being a banker or a farmer. Was the slaughter of some 1.5 million communists in Indonesia in the middle 1960s an act of genocide or not? Well, that depends on whether you think that being a communist is more similar to being, for instance, a Buddhist or, say, an aristocrat. And even then it's not clear, as it's not clear the extent to which being either a Buddhist or an aristocrat is more or less like being, say, a neoliberal, a Tory, or blue-eyed. But I think bearing that sort of inevitable limitation in mind, we can get at least a little bit further. Nor, by the way, should this limitation be seen as a problem. Of course, genocide cannot be defined. Nothing real can be defined. You can't define this pen that I'm holding in my hand. You can describe it, but you can't define it. Only ideas can be defined, not real things. So I think we can say that it's from the inescapability of identity that it follows that you can't in any way appease your would-be killers. You're in their way, whether literally, metaphorically, or both. And being who you are, you can't get out of their way, even if you wish to try. There's no question of negotiation. You're the target of genocide because of who you are. Another issue, though, I think needs to be raised, and it's a difficult one. The issue of whether it's the intention with which it's done that makes an act of mass killing genocide, or whether what counts are the consequences for the targeted group. Must there be genocidal intention, or is genocidal outcome sufficient for an act of mass killing to be described as genocide? Well, it's not surprising that both intention and consequences should be thought important. After all, these two concerns basically characterize the two central theories of Western moral philosophy: consequentialism, deontology. The terms don't really matter. And I think these two theories, that what matters is what happens, on the other hand, what matters is what you intend, it's not surprising that these two theories have become pervasive, because both answer to a central element of our moral experience. Consequences of what we do, our intentions in so doing. One concern is with the consequences of what people do, so that what matters, for instance, is that some 700 people were killed as a result of what some other people did or did not do at this year's Hajj pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia. What matters is that some 500,000 Iraqi civilians were killed in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq by the USA and its idiot allies. What matters is that some 800,000 so-called Tutsi were killed in Rwanda by the so-called Hutu. And so on and on and on. There are too many examples. But there is another concern as well, about the intentions of the perpetrators. What matters here is what such and such people saw fit to do, what they did and why they did it. The Nazis, the torturers, the rapists, the neoliberal imperialists, whoever. Some things ought never to be done, whatever the consequences. Deliberately to kill one person to save 100 others is wrong, regardless of the consequences. How do we decide between these two different views, especially given that both of them answer to some extent our experience? I don't think we need to. I don't think we should even try. Why not? Well, fundamentally, because as my colleague Zaina Masri has taught me to see, the question is fundamentally for those affected to make those decisions. It's not for academics, Eurocentric or otherwise, to decide, however learnedly, whether or not such and such an instance of killing finally counts as genocide, whether it's a matter of intention or of outcome. It's enough that genocide, the mass killing of a group of people on account of who they are, has been experienced as such. What matters to those who have been killed, and perhaps to those who survive and all those who come later, is the fact of their having been slaughtered. The killer's reasons are secondary. Put yourself in the place of the friends and family of somebody killed by a drunk driver, for instance. And so also with the scope of genocidal effort, whether it's aimed to rid this place of such and such people, or to rid the whole world of such and such people. It might well matter to the perpetrators whether they're killing to rid the world of a group, or to rid what they consider to be their own space of that group. And it may well be that it's important to differentiate these and indeed other forms of genocide if we're going to avoid it. And of course the only good reason to be concerned at all about the logic, structure and history of genocide is to try to avoid it. Intention matters. It matters materially. But if we're not to disrespect the memory of those people who have been subjected to genocide, then it's to them and to theirs that we have first to listen. Because what matters first and foremost is their experience of what other people are doing to them. Otherwise, in the end, we extend the power of the perpetrators at the expense of the people whom they're responsible for killing. It's not the case that only universal extermination counts as genocide and local extermination does not. Both are genocide because both are experienced as genocide. Genocide, let us say, can take a number of forms. So where does all this leave us? And I've nearly finished. Where does this leave us? Let me go back for a moment to the stuff about consequences and intentions. Another way of saying why both of these things seem to matter, even though they pull in different moral directions very often, is to say that consequentialism, concern for the consequences of actions, is really what politics is all about. And that a concern with doing the right thing, irrespective of the consequences, is what morality is all about. If that's right, and I'm not at all sure that it is, it's just a suggestion. But if that were right, then genocide turns out to be a fundamentally political term, rather than fundamentally a moral term. But that might be too stark, I don't know. It may be that genocide is a political term with moral ramifications. And I'd be interested to see what people think of that. So to finish, finally, why does genocide matter so much? Actually, it turns out that there isn't really much to say once we've understood what genocide is. Genocide matters because it's a paradigm case of denying our fundamental equality as people. My identity is fine, yours is impermissible. People like me are real people, people like you are cockroaches, they're lice. We are people, you are Roma, Armenian, Redskin, Negro, or whatever. You must die on account of who you are, I don't. And it's simply because genocide reflects that sort of thinking, if that's not too grand a term, that it matters so much. So let me finish by putting those last few words in a slightly different way. Is it ever right to kill anybody? And I'm not thinking of assisted suicide here. Other than that, is it ever right to kill anybody? If it is, and I'm not expressing a view one way or another, but if it is, then that I think can be only on account of what such a person is doing. Self-defense is the classic instance. If it's ever justifiable at all to kill somebody, then it's on account of somebody's acting, on account of someone exercising their responsibility, that it might be justifiable to kill them. But of course, genocide is utterly unlike that. Genocide is killing people not because of what they're doing, but because of who they are. So it turns out to be a matter of logic that there can be no good reason for genocide. Now that might seem obvious. Indeed, of course it's obvious. It is indeed obvious. But sometimes, unfortunately, the obvious needs to be said and to be repeated. And that's where I'll finish. Thank you very much.